The boy had been missing since 6:14 in the morning. That was the time his grandmother, Ruth Kowalski, had looked out the kitchen window and seen the back gate of the property standing open. The latch swung wide the way it always swung when 8-year-old Danny had worked it himself. She had called his name twice across the yard. She had waited. Then she called 911. By the time the first cruiser arrived, the Kessler County Search and Rescue Coordinator had already authorized the deployment of the department's thermal drone unit, a Matrice 350 RTK with a Zenmuse H20T camera system that had cost the county $29,000 at last year's budget cycle and had been the centerpiece of 3 separate press releases. The coordinator's name was Derek Haas. He was 38 years old, had a master's degree in emergency management from Auburn, and had been running Kessler County SAR for 4 years. He was good at it in a systems way. He thought in grids and probability zones, and he communicated in the clipped, efficient shorthand of a man who had spent considerable energy designing processes that could survive human error. He stood at the tailgate of his response vehicle at 7:40 a.m. with a tablet showing the terrain map, 2 drone operators beside him, and a growing knot of neighbors at the property line who were being managed by a deputy with the weary patience of a man who has managed crowds at accident scenes. The search grid was already divided. North quadrant first, working toward the tree line. Then the creek drainage east of the property. Then the old Miller orchard on the south side, which was overgrown enough to matter. The thermal camera would pick up a child's heat signature through light canopy. Haas had run this protocol twice before, once for an Alzheimer's patient outside Meridian, once for a teenage boy who had gone into the woods after a fight with his father. Both recoveries had taken under 2 hours. Both had been resolved by the drone. He did not notice the old man sitting on Ruth Kowalski's back steps until the man stood up. He was tall, or had been. The years had compressed him some, the way they compress men who have carried weight for a long time. He wore a canvas work shirt, dark green, the kind sold at farm supply stores, and trousers that had been pressed once and were holding the crease out of habit. His hands were large, and his face was the face of a man who had spent years in sun and wind and had made peace with what that meant. He had a cup of coffee that he did not appear to be drinking, only holding. Ruth then had introduced him to the deputy when the deputy arrived. His name was Raymond Goss. He was 71 years old, and he had driven 40 minutes from Burkhart when Ruthin called him because she didn't know who else to call, her son being in Houston and her daughter being 20 minutes out and Raymond being the one person she trusted to stand in the yard and not make things worse. He had been her late husband's friend for 30 years, and he had known Danny since the boy was born. He said nothing to the deputy that the deputy found particularly notable. He asked which direction the gate had been facing when it was found open. The deputy told him north-northwest toward the creek. Raymond nodded and drank his coffee and sat down on the steps. That was at 7:15. He had been sitting there for 25 minutes when Haas got the drone up. The Matrice lifted clean in the cool morning air and banked north. On the tablet screen, the thermal feed showed the gray-green negative space of the landscape, the heat signatures of the gathered people at the perimeter registering as white blooms, the tree line a textured band of cooler color at the north edge of the grid. Haas watched the feed with the focused attention of a man who had trained himself to see small things in large images. The drone moved in the systematic S pattern he had set. Raymond walked to the tailgate. He did not introduce himself again. He looked at the tablet for a moment and then looked north toward the tree line, which was about 300 yards from where they stood. He said, "What's the creek depth this time of year?" Haas looked at him. "Sir, I need you to stay back from the operational area." "I'm not in your operational area. I'm standing at your tailgate asking what the creek depth is." One of the drone operators, a young man named Cody, looked up from his controller. Haas said, "The creek drainage is in the secondary grid. We're covering north first." "The gate was facing north-northwest," Raymond said. "Creek's northwest. A boy that age moving at first light before the sun's up is going to follow the sound of water. It's the loudest thing in that direction this time of morning." Haas set the tablet down on the tailgate. He said, "Sir, I appreciate the input. We have a protocol that accounts for all. What's the protocol for a boy who found the creek, crossed it at the shallow ford, and went into the second tree line on the other side?" Haas looked at him for a beat. The drone's thermal coverage extends beyond the visible tree line. Through 140 feet of mixed canopy, another beat. We have good penetration on light canopy. Raymond looked at the tree line. He looked back at Haas. He said, "I'm going to take a walk," and he set his coffee cup on the tailgate next to the tablet and walked north. Haas said, Sir, I need you to," he stopped. He looked at Cody. Cody was watching the old man walk. The deputy materialized at Haas's elbow. "You want me to go after him?" Haas watched Raymond move through the yard toward the fence line. The man walked the way very few people walk, with the unhurried forward progress of someone who knows exactly where his feet are and has stopped thinking about it. "No," Haas said, not entirely sure why. If this story is hitting home for you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've got a veteran in your family, share their branch in the comments. I read everyone. Raymond Goss had come home from Vietnam in March of 1970 with a discharge, a duffel bag, and a skill set that had no civilian translation. He had spent 32 months in country, the last 18 with the 5th Special Forces Group out of Nha Trang, running long-range recon in terrain that had no good maps and required a different kind of navigation than the kind that could be taught in a classroom. The Central Highlands were not country that forgave inattention. The canopy ran thick enough in places to cancel noon, and the trails that looked like trails were sometimes not trails, and the quiet that sounded like safety was sometimes the specific quiet of men waiting in it. He had learned to read ground the way a reader reads a page, quickly and below the level of conscious thought, the information arriving as certainty rather than calculation. He had learned that water was always the organizing principle of human movement. Troops moved toward it, wildlife moved toward it, and children, who were in many ways the most honest navigators on Earth, moved toward it without knowing they were doing it. The skill was not mystical. It was accumulated attention. You learned, over many months of moving through country that would kill you for a wrong step, to read the 1,000 small signals the ground gave off about what had moved through it and in what direction and how long ago. You learned to distinguish between a stem bent by wind and a stem bent by a boot. You learned to see the secondary evidence, not just the track itself, but the way a spider web had been re-anchored after being broken, the way the moss on the north face of a root had been brushed free of its morning dew, the way a low branch carried scratch marks at a particular height. You learned, most importantly, to build a picture from incomplete data because the ground never gave you a complete story. It gave you fragments, and you had to be honest about what the fragments supported. He had come home to Burkhart and spent the next 40 years doing things that had nothing to do with what he had done in Vietnam. He ran the hardware store his father had left him until the hardware store couldn't survive the big box that opened 12 miles away, and then he worked county road maintenance for 17 years. And then he retired to the 3 acres outside Burkhart, where he grew a garden that his neighbors thought was too large, and tended a wood shop that produced furniture people drove considerable distances to buy. He did not talk about the service. His wife Martha had known the general shape of it, and had known better than to require the specifics. His son Carl knew his father had been in Vietnam, and that this was not a subject that invited conversation. The veterans at the county VFW knew Raymond by sight, and knew he had done something in the war that was not the kind of thing men discuss casually, because men who had done the kind of thing Raymond had done did not come into the VFW on Friday nights and tell stories about it. They came in and drank their coffee and listened, which is a different thing. What they had done lived in them as a kind of permanent background awareness that most people around them did not possess and could not be taught quickly. It was not useful at dinner parties. At 8:23 on a May morning in Kessler County, with a child missing and a $30,000 machine drawing empty circles in the sky, it was the only thing that mattered. He had crossed the fence at the north edge of Ruthan's property and moved into the high grass beyond it. The grass was still wet from the overnight, and his trousers darkened at the cuffs. He was reading the ground without looking at it directly, which was not a contradiction. A man trained in land navigation reads the landscape the way a musician reads a room, through peripheral attention and the interpretation of accumulated small data. The grass here had been moved through. Not recently enough to still be showing the disturbance, but the seed heads on the north side of the path were facing differently from the south side, which meant something had pressed through and the stems had corrected. An animal or a person. A person of low height. The disturbance was at knee level for an adult. He moved through the grass to the tree line. Inside the first tree line, the light was lower and the ground was softer, the leaf fall for the previous autumn still damp enough to hold an impression. He found the impression in 4 minutes. A shoe, small, the tread of a child's sneaker, pressing into the leaf mat at the edge of a root. Then another, 3 feet forward and to the left foot slightly turned out the way a child's left foot turns out when he is moving without paying attention to it. He followed the track to the creek. The creek was running well for late spring, maybe 8 inches deep at the center with a gravel bar on the east bank that collected smooth stones the size of a child's hand. There were 2 of those stones sitting side by side on the gravel bar in a formation that had not been made by water. Danny Kowalski had picked them up and set them there and moved on. Raymond crossed the creek at the ford. The water was cold through his boot leather, and he did not alter his pace. On the far side, the second tree line was denser, the canopy closing overhead into something that would be very difficult for a thermal camera to read at altitude. He moved into it. Above him, beyond the canopy, he could hear the drone at intervals as it swept its grid. The sound was persistent and covered a great deal of sky and found nothing useful, because the thing it was looking for was 80 feet under old-growth maple and white oak in a depression that held the cool air of the creek, and a child's heat signature in cool pooled air under 100-year-old canopy was not something the Matrice 350 RTK's Zenmuse H20T was going to resolve at 300 feet. Raymond found Danny Kowalski sitting in the depression with his back against a maple trunk and 6 smooth stones arranged in a line in front of him, apparently waiting to be thrown at something or simply organized in the way children organize things to make a place feel inhabited. The light came through the canopy in the filtered, indirect way it comes through old hardwood forest in the morning, not the sharp angles of direct sun, but a diffused gray-green that made the depression feel separate from the world above it. It was the kind of place a child would find interesting and a soldier would find defensible, which were not entirely different instincts. The boy looked up when Raymond came through the undergrowth, and his face went through the sequence that children's faces go through in those moments. The spike of startlement, the read for threat, the collapse into relief. "Mr. Raymond," Danny said. "Hey, bud, I found the creek. I know. I followed your tracks." The boy looked at the stones in front of him. "I was going to go back. I was going to go back when the sun got higher." "That was good thinking," Raymond said. And he meant it because it was. The boy had oriented himself by light and had been waiting for a reliable cue to navigate by. That was not a stupid thing to do. "Your grandma's worried. Is she mad?" "She's more worried than mad." Raymond crouched down to the boy's level with the protest of joints that had been used hard for many years and did not make that effort quietly. He looked at the 6 stones. "You want to carry these back or leave them?" Danny considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to genuinely consequential decisions. "Leave them," he said, "so I know where I went." "Good thinking," Raymond said again. He stood. He offered his hand, and Danny took it, and they walked back through the second tree line, across the creek, through the first tree line, and out through the high grass into Ruth and Kowalski's yard. They came out of the grass at 8:23 a.m. The drone had been in the air for 43 minutes. The search had been running for 2 hours and 9 minutes. Raymond had been walking for 38 minutes. Derek Haas saw them from the operational area. He watched the old man come through the fence line with the boy's hand in his. He watched Ruthin cross the yard at a speed that her age did not suggest she was capable of, and drop to her knees in the wet grass and pull her grandson into both arms. He watched the deputy radio and that the subject had been located and was ambulatory and uninjured. He watched Cody bring the drone down. He stood there for a moment with his tablet in his hand. If you're with us this far, do the old man a favor and hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag a veteran in your life in the comments. Let them know somebody still sees them. Captain Jerome Willits, U.S. Army, retired, had come to Kessler County to visit his daughter and her family. who lived 4 properties east of the Kowalski place. He had heard the sirens and come out to his daughter's front porch and watched the activity at the property line and made certain assessments about what was happening. He had spent 22 years as an infantry officer and 4 of those years working with Special Forces advisors and assignments he did not discuss at dinner parties. He knew something about how men who had done that kind of work moved through terrain, and he had watched Raymond Goss cross the yard and the fence line at 7:45 from his daughter's porch and had thought, I know what that is. He walked over when the boy came out of the tree line. He waited until Ruthven had her grandson inside, and the deputy had finished his radio traffic, and the operational area had relaxed from its crisis posture into the quieter business of breakdown and documentation. Then he walked to the tailgate, where Raymond was retrieving his coffee cup, which was cold now. Willett said, You do a tracking course, or is that field trained? Raymond looked at him. He read the posture and the bearing and the specific way the man had asked the question, which was not the way a civilian asks a question. Field trained, he said. Where? Central Highlands, mostly. Sometime in the Delta. 5 group. A pause. Last 18 months. Willits was quiet for a moment. He was doing the math that men of a certain age do when they meet someone who was in a particular place at a particular time and understand what that means. MACVSOG. Raymond drank his cold coffee. I was attached for a stretch. Haas had walked over. He had been standing close enough to hear the last part of the exchange without intending to, and now he was standing there with his tablet and the specific discomfort of a man who has built a system that just failed in a way he has to account for. He said, Mr. Goss. Raymond looked at him. I owe you an apology for the way I spoke to you earlier. Raymond said nothing. You found the boy in 38 minutes. My drone has been in the air for 43 and found nothing. Haas paused. He was not a man who practiced the speech before he gave it. He was giving it the way it had formed in him while he watched the old man come through the fence line with the boy's hand in his. I'm asking if you're willing for a conversation about what you read that I didn't. Raymond set the coffee cup down. He looked at the tree line to the north, and at the fence, and at the place in the high grass where the passage through was still faintly visible. He said, Gate was facing north-northwest. That's the first thing. A gate that age swings on a bias toward its own weight. If the latch is on the left, the gate's going to arc right when it's released. North-northwest means the boy went through and didn't push it back, which means he was moving with purpose, not wandering. A wandering child pushes things back because he's not sure he should be where he is. A child with a destination doesn't. Haas was writing nothing down. He was listening in a way that people listen when they understand they are receiving instruction. Second thing is the sound of the creek. That time of morning before the sun's up and the birds are loud, the creek is the most prominent sound in that direction. A boy who's been to that property more than a few times has heard it. Children move toward known sounds. They're not stupid. They're oriented toward the familiar. Raymond looked at the tablet. Your grid puts the creek in the secondary search area because it's further from the house. But closer in distance is not the same as closer in a child's mind. Closer in a child's mind is whatever he's already gone toward before. Haas said, I should have asked Ruthann about his patterns. Yes, and the Canopy. Your camera is good equipment. The problem isn't the equipment. The problem is that equipment reads what's there. It doesn't read what should be there. I wasn't looking for a heat signature. I was looking for a line of travel through ground that a child would find easiest to walk. Those are different problems. Willits had been listening to all of this from 3 feet away with the expression of a man who is watching a thing be named that he has known for a long time, but never heard stated directly. He said, Mr. Goss, what unit? Raymond looked at him. 5th Group, Bravo Company, 2nd Detachment. We weren't on any paperwork that I ever found. Willits was quiet. Then he said, Sir, and he brought his right hand up. Raymond held the salute for a beat, the reflex still living in his right hand after 50 years, and returned it. He picked up his coffee cup and walked back to the steps where he had been sitting. The story spread the way those stories spread in small counties, through the deputy's radio traffic and the neighbor who had been at the property line and the drone operators who told their friends. By noon, there were 3 separate accounts of it on the county's community Facebook page, two of which had the facts substantially right, and one of which had Raymond Goss finding the boy in 10 minutes, which was wrong, but was not wrong in spirit. The county emergency management director called Haas at 2 in the afternoon. The conversation was short. Haas had already written a one-page addendum to his after-action report recommending that future juvenile missing person protocols in rural terrain environments include a mandatory interview with family members regarding the child's known exploration patterns before grid assignment, and that when local residents with military fieldcraft background were present and offered input, that input be incorporated rather than declined on procedural grounds. He did not name Raymond Goss in the recommendation. The recommendation did not require a name to mean what it meant. Willits knocked on Ruth Ann's door at 3 in the afternoon with a bottle of something from his daughter's pantry and a specific purpose of sitting with Raymond for a while. Raymond let him in. They sat in Ruth Ann's kitchen while she made coffee, and Danny slept in the back bedroom, worn out from the morning and the creak and the relief that follows a child's understanding that the people who love him have found him. They talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with Vietnam, and then they talked about Vietnam, and then they talked about the things that had come after it, the long years of not being asked and not saying, and carrying something that had no civilian weight. Willits had done 3 tours and had the kind of career that got written about in monographs that circulated in very small professional communities. Raymond had done what Raymond had done and had come home and run a hardware store. At some point, Ruth Ann put a plate of sandwiches on the table and sat down with them. And Danny came out from the back in his socks and climbed onto Raymond's lap and said, "Mr. Raymond, how did you find me?" And Raymond said, "You left tracks." And Danny said, "What kind of tracks?" And Raymond said, "The right kind." And Danny said, "Can you teach me?" And Raymond said, "Ask your mom," which was not a no. When Willits left at 5, he shook Raymond's hand at the door in the way men shake hands when they are saying something that doesn't have words. The grip held a beat longer than necessary, the release deliberate. He said, "I'm glad you drove 40 minutes this morning." Raymond said, "She needed someone to stand in the yard." "That's not all you did." Raymond looked at him. "No, but that's why I came." Ruth Ann walked Raymond to his truck at 5:30. The light was going long and orange across the yard, and the gate to the north was properly latched now, the deputy having fixed the mechanism before he left. She held his arm walking across the grass because the grass was still damp, and he was 71 and she was 67, and that was simply what people did. She said, "Harold always said you were the best man he knew." Raymond said, "Harold was generous. Harold was accurate." She stopped at the truck door. "You found my boy." He said nothing. "You drove 40 minutes, and you found my boy in 38 minutes with your feet, Raymond. That machine was up there for 43 and found nothing, and you walked out of those trees with my grandson's hand in yours." She looked at him in the way that women who have known a man for 30 years look at him when they want him to understand something without argument. "You should let people know that about you." Raymond opened the truck door. He said, "Danny knows it. That's enough." He drove home to Burkhart in the long evening light. The 3 acres were quiet when he got there, the garden in its late spring fullness, the wood shop dark. He went inside and washed his hands and made himself a meal he didn't particularly taste and sat in the chair by the window that looked north toward the same kind of country he had walked through that morning. Different ground, but the same essential nature. Trees and water, and the way terrain tells you where things go if you know how to listen to it. He thought about the boy's 6 stones lined up at the base of the maple, a child marking his territory, making the unknown space familiar, building a small order in a large wilderness. He understood that impulse at a level that had nothing to do with childhood and everything to do with what it meant to move through country that didn't know your name and find a way to orient yourself that the country couldn't take back. Danny had gone into those woods not because he was lost, but because he was curious, and he had stayed because he knew, in the way children know things their instinct have not yet been trained out of, that he should wait for the light to tell him which way was home. That was not a mistake. That was judgment of a kind that most adults had spent years having educated away from them. He cleaned his boots at the back door. He hung the canvas shirt. He went to bed at 9:30 and was asleep before 10, the way men sleep when they have spent themselves completely on something that mattered. On the shelf in his bedroom, Next to the photograph of Martha from their first year in the house, there was a small wooden box he had made himself. Inside the box were things he had carried home from Vietnam and kept without ever displaying. A compass that still worked, a folded square of terrain map from the Central Highlands with route lines drawn in fading pencil, and a citation he had never framed, the paper soft at the folds, the language formal and dry and entirely inadequate to the thing it was describing. He had not opened the box in several years. He did not open it that night. He knew what was in it. What had happened that morning was not in the box. It was in the ground north of Ruthin Kowalski's yard, in the track of a child's sneaker pressed into wet leaf mat, in 6 smooth creek stones lined up at the base of a maple tree, in the hand of a boy who had been found not by a $30,000 machine working a systematic grid, but by a man who had learned 50 years ago in a country that no longer existed how to read the way the world tells you, where the living things have gone. Some knowledge doesn't expire. Some of it just waits for the morning it's needed. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. We tell these stories so the men who live them are never forgotten. See you in the next one.